Hello everyone, this video is going to be all about how to create these 5 super easy watercolor Christmassy / holiday cards. You can really customize these ideas to create whatever you need a card for. Let's start off with the main materials that you'll need. First is obviously watercolor paint. You'll also need some brushes, your preferred sketching materials, some watercolor paper. These are going to be 5x7 cards, so I'm mainly going to be using 9x12 watercolor paper and cutting it down. Some masonite board or another hard surface, some masking or painter's tape, a ruler, scissors and or a craft knife, and optionally some cardstock paper. It's up to you whether you want to use some colored cardstock or not. You also might require some glue and another optional supply, some gel pens. I really liked using these metallic ones. We're going to start off with the triple tree card. There are lots of different ways you can start and set up the card, which you will see as I go through the different cards in the video. For this one, I'm going to be using watercolor paper for the entire card. I'm starting off by taping down my watercolor paper with some painter's tape onto a masonite board. Now I'm going to measure about 5.5 inches from the side of the painter's tape. These are going to be 5x7 cards, but I also want a little wiggle room around the edges just to have an extra bit of trimming, just in case something happens around the edge of the paper. For this particular card, I'm also measuring the 7 inches down from the painter's tape, just so I know the final dimensions of the finished card. And I'm taking my ruler and going along those markings lightly, just so I know where my cut lines are going to be, as well as the fold line. This is going to be a horizontal card, so I'm going to turn my paper and lightly make some markings showing the center of the 5x7 as well as the quarter points. Now along those points, I'm just lightly kind of putting in some lines just so I kind of have an idea of where the trees are going to go, as well as having kind of some guidelines to make sure that I actually put the trees in straight. Now with my watercolor paint, I'm basically just kind of going to freehand in some trees using some different shades of watercolor. You know, it's really good to use lots of water here so that the colors blend together. You know, you want some nice texture in these trees, all of that kind of stuff. But basically just roughly put in the trees with your paintbrush, kind of flicking out the edges so that it kind of looks like branches. And do that, I would recommend first for the 2 side trees. Let those dry and then work on the central tree. You can really do these trees in whatever color you want. You could even do them in a single color each and just kind of dab in some more paint in areas so that there's a variation in texture. And like I said, let those trees completely dry before you move on to the middle tree. Now I'm just adding the middle tree, kind of making it look like it is behind the other 2. And I'm just going in here with a light bluish gray color just so that the trees don't look like they're floating and more like they're sitting on some snow. Make sure you let the paint completely dry before going ahead and removing the painter's tape. And now I'm just taking my paper cutter and trimming it along that line that I made to measure the 7-inch mark, as well as just trimming the other sides to get a 7x10-inch piece of paper, seeing as it isn't a folded card yet. Now I just decided to erase the little marks that I'd made for the 5 inches and then match up the corners and fold the card in half. I just ended up using my ruler to kind of make that a sharper fold. I actually decided after to go in with a white gel pen and kind of define the trees from each other, like define the 2 front trees from the back tree. And then I also decided to add some ornaments with a metallic gel pen. And that is how you make a triple tree card. Next is the cutout snowflake card. For an additional supply, you're going to need a broad tip marker. For this card, I actually cut a 9x12 sheet of paper in half to give me 2 9x6-inch pieces of paper. Then again, I'm going to tape that piece of watercolor paper onto a masonite board with some painter's tape. This time I'm not worried about cutting any of the edges off, so I'm just going to put the tape down and worry about cutting it down to size later. Now I'm really just going to create a textured watercolor wash using different colors. I do want it to be fairly dark so that this stands out against a white background, which will be later. So keep that in mind when you're painting this. You will probably want it to be fairly saturated. If you weren't really into texture like this, you could always create something like a gradient of different colors instead. Once the first layer is dry, I actually decided to do more layers, and really this is up to you. You can do as many layers to build up the color as you want. Once you're happy with how things look, let it completely dry and then remove the tape. Trim the page down to a 5x7 sheet. Again, I'm just using my paper slicer. Now it's time to cut the design out. I'm going to be doing it as a snowflake, but you can really do any design you want. I'm going to be drawing all of this on the back of the watercolor paper. Now to draw the snowflake, I started off by measuring the center point of both sides, and then I went ahead and did diagonals between those quadrants. I just put those horizontal lines there to help me get the same angle as the diagonal that I already drew. Now I'm going along and measuring and marking 2 inches from the center point on each line. This is going to be where the tip of the snowflake ends. Then I'm going to go back around on each point and measure 1 inch and 1.5 inches from the center point. These are going to be the little markings to do the offshoots from each snowflake branch, or whatever you want to call them. Then I'm just going to be drawing the 2 parallel diagonal pieces as design on the snowflake. I also drew some triangle-like shapes in each section to create a center design. Once you're happy with the shape of your snowflake, I actually just used a Crayola, normal kind of washable marker to thicken up the lines to make it easier to have kind of a uniform cut. Obviously, you want this snowflake to actually have some width to the design, so I figured just going over it with a more broad tip marker was a super easy way to kind of give yourself that depth as a guideline before you cut it. And then of course, once you have actually gone over the design, you can begin to cut. Obviously, this is much more easily done with some sort of craft or X-Acto knife. Just make sure that your surface is protected with a cutting mat and just kind of go to town. And if you are really careful with how you cut this snowflake out, you'll even be able to use the reverse part of this as another card if you want. Once you have the snowflake cut out all the way around, gently remove it from the solid piece of paper. Now I'm just taking a plain 8.5x11 sheet of white cardstock and cutting that down to be the 5x7 card size, so a 7-inch by 10-inch sheet of paper, and I'm just folding that in half to actually create the card. This part is actually fairly optional. I just decided to use some of my scrap paper and basically create spacers to glue between the watercolor page and the cardstock to kind of raise it up a bit so that there was some nice definition between the watercolor where you could see like the cutout snowflake was actually cut out. So like I said, I just used some of my scrap paper, cut 4 of those, folded them in half so that they were double layered, glued those together, and then glued them onto the inner kind of corner area on the back of the watercolor paper. Once you have those spacers attached to the watercolor paper, you can go ahead, put some glue onto those, and then actually stick that onto the front of the cardstock. And that is the finished cutout snowflake card. Now onto the ornament card. Some additional supplies that you might want for this card would be a fine line marker or ballpoint pen. I'm making this particular card fully out of watercolor paper again, so once more I am taping down the 3 edges of the watercolor paper before measuring the 5x7 dimensions from the edge of the tape and then putting in that 4th piece of tape. Although for this particular card I really didn't need to put that other piece of tape in, so I'm not exactly sure why I did it, but yeah, you don't really need the tape for this one because there isn't an edge there. Now it's time to start actually drawing the ornaments. So I used my ruler to create the string of the ornament, and then this one I'm going to have be the front ornament, and I'm going to make that more of a teardrop shape. But again, you can make any kind of a combination of circular or other shaped ornaments that you would like. I would recommend, however, that you do an odd amount of ornaments and also vary the size of the ornaments. Once you have all your ornaments drawn on, you can start to paint them. Now, I am personally going to do mine as solid colors with kind of gradients up into the upper corner to make them look like they have light reflecting off of them, but you can really paint these however you want. You can do patterns, you could do different textures, whatever you kind of want to do with your ornaments. Once that first layer of paint has dried, I actually decided to go over them a second time to deepen up some of the colors. Once the paint has completely dried, go in with a fine line marker and draw in the top of the ornaments as well as the ornament strings. And I actually went in with a kneaded eraser to get rid of any excess pencil lines around the ornaments. I also decided to use a metallic gel pen to color in the tops of the ornaments. I just thought it would be cool to have a bit of a texture change with the different finish of the metallic pen. And then of course, once you're done all of that, remove the tape. Once again, I'm using my paper trimmer to cut the excess of the watercolor paper down to be the 5x7 card size. So again, in this case, because the entire card is going to be watercolor paper, it is a 10x7 inch piece that I'm cutting. Then I just erased more of the pencil lines that I used as guidelines before, and then actually folded the watercolor paper in half to create the card. I also decided that I wanted to add some silver dots around the ornaments just for a little more decoration so that the background didn't look too plain. And that is the finished ornament card. Next up is the Winter Woods card. Now, if you are planning on making the next two cards, you will need masking fluid and also something to apply the masking fluid with. For me, that's one of these bottles actually meant for henna tattoos. For this card, you're actually going to want to measure out the 5x7 dimensions on a slightly larger sheet of paper. Once you have those measurements lightly penciled in, you can begin to tape your piece of paper onto your surface. Now I'm just going to very lightly mark in where I want some of the trees to go. You could do this free-handed in the masking fluid, but I just wanted some kind of guidelines as to what might look most visually appealing. And now, with my masking fluid, I am basically filling in all of the trees. Now, I am trying to leave some of the bark kind of notches to actually be painted in the color, but if you don't have that fine of a control over your masking fluid, you can always put those in later. So like I said, I am just filling in the entire trunks of the trees and also freehanding in some branches. Now make sure your masking fluid is completely dry before you start going in with paint. Now all I did was take a dark blue color and wash that across the entire page, making it lighter as it gradually went down to the bottom. So if you wanted, you could create this as a gradient with various colors, but I just decided to keep it all in the blue family. You might have to go over this a couple of times to get the level of color that you want, but once the paint has completely dried and you're happy with it, you can begin to remove the masking fluid. I'm just using this gummy eraser thing that is meant to pick up masking fluid just to help get all of the small little bits off. Now, if you didn't manage to get some of the lines into the trunks already, now would be the time to go in with the same paint color that you used for the background and put those lines into the trunks. Even if you did get some of the lines in, you might want to add more. And of course, once that paint has completely dried, you can go ahead and remove the painter's tape. And now you can trim that back down to the 5x7 size with whatever means you're using to do so. I actually decided to add in some snowflakes with a white gel pen into the dark background. I already cut some white cardstock down to size, and now I'm just folding that and gluing on the watercolor paper onto the front of the card. And that is the finished Winter Woods card. And last but not least, we have the Snowstorm card. Again, for this card, I am making it entirely out of watercolor paper, so I have a full 9x12 sheet that I am taping down onto my masonite board. So taping down the three sides, I decided to then measure out about 5.5 inches just so I had a bit of wiggle room. This card you can easily lose edges on, so that's fine, and then along those markings I just added another piece of painter's tape. You want to start off by laying down a very, very light wash of watercolor. I decided to wet my paper first just so that the paint was nice and diluted, just so that it didn't oversaturate the paper right away. Like I said, make sure you keep it light. I've just decided to splotch on some various colors to create a bit of texture and a nice little watercolor look. Make sure that your paper has completely dried before going on to this next step. With your masking fluid, start drawing on some snowflakes, whether that is actual snowflakes or just dots that appear to be snowflakes. But the trick is you do not want to fill the page up completely because we will be adding more masking fluid later. So definitely leave some open areas. Make sure that your masking fluid is completely dry before adding your next layer of paint. This layer you want to be a little more saturated than the last one, but you still don't want it to be at like the max level of saturation for your colors. We're basically creating the really easy version of negative space painting with this technique. Then again, let your paper completely dry before adding some more masking fluid. Again, you're going to want to leave a bit of extra room for another layer of masking fluid later, but just go ahead and add a couple more snowflakes and dots here and there. What this masking fluid and paint layer combination is doing is it's creating a variation in the levels of color of the snowflakes. So obviously the first snowflakes that you put masking fluid for are going to be very light, but seeing as this next layer has quite a bit more paint on it, they're going to be a little bit darker than those first ones. And of course, once your masking fluid has completely dried once again, add another layer of paint. This one, again, a little darker than the last layer. I mean, just naturally layering up the watercolors like this will create a darker color, but you might want to use a little less water in your mixture with your paints. And you'll never guess what. Once your paint has completely dried again, add some more masking fluid. This I decided was going to be my final layer of snowflakes, so I did fill in basically all the gaps that I wanted to. But obviously, if you want, you can continue to go to town with the various layers of snowflakes if you want. Now, seeing as this was my planned final layer of masking fluid, I definitely made sure that this last layer was significantly darker than the other ones. So I actually decided to use some darker paint colors that still went with the whole theme, but I did want the snowflakes to show up fairly well, so I did decide to make this one significantly darker, and that's something you might want to look at too, using paints that you know are more pigmented than the ones you might have previously used. And then once the paint has completely dried, I decided to use my gum eraser again to remove all the tiny bits of masking fluid. And then you just want to gently remove the painter's tape and cut the card down to size. And once you have your cut card, match up the corners and fold it in half. The nice thing about this particular card design is you can really orient it either way. And that is the finished snowstorm card. And that is how you make these 5 super easy watercolor cards. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.